Hello and welcome to Sophy Ridge on Sunday. It's 3 days before the budget. We've got the Chancellor and the Shadow Chancellor on the programme. A week ago, I thought I knew exactly how this programme would go. But that's before a tweet by Gary Lineker turned into a full-blown existential crisis for the BBC. The Match of the Day presenter was taken off air for breaching impartiality guidelines, prompting a mass walkout by other staff. Well, the Director-General has apologised to viewers, but he is under pressure to solve a crisis that snowballed in a matter of days. And don't worry, there will also be plenty of budget coverage on the show today as well. In a moment, we will hear from the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, ahead of his big speech on Wednesday. We'll also get reaction from Labour with the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. Also this morning, someone who knows a thing or two about writing budget speeches, the former Chancellor, Lord Hammond. And we'll talk to the former England teammate of Gary Lineker, John Barnes, as that BBC impartiality row spirals. And we'll also be joined on the show this morning by the SNP leadership candidate, Ash Regan. That's ahead of tomorrow night's big live TV debate on Sky News. Hello, good morning. Well, it's a big week in British politics with the budget on Wednesday. Let's crack straight on, shall we? We can hear from the Chancellor. Thank you very much for being on the programme.
Good morning, Sophie.
Good morning. Now, I appreciate it might feel slightly strange starting a pre-budget interview talking about a tweet from Gary Lineker, but it has spiralled into a full-blown crisis for the BBC. Do you think he needs to apologise?
Well, I personally profoundly disagree with the comments that he made. But I think what this shows, and indeed the related debate about the BBC chairman's appointment, and we should wait until the investigation is completely independent investigation before passing judgment on that, is that impartiality at the BBC is really important. The reason that it is a great national institution that we all treasure so much is because it is respected for impartiality. So we need to make sure that what comes out of this is that people's confidence in the impartiality of the BBC is restored.
So you think that it's been compromised by the...
No, and I don't think it's for me. I'm one of the people, by the way, who the BBC scrutinise, and as do you in your show. And so it's not for me to tell the BBC how to do that. But I think what this has shown is how important the BBC is to all of us. And the central thing that people want to know is that, you know, there isn't any kind of political agenda in the way the BBC goes about its business, which I'm not saying there is, but that is the confidence people need to have.
But that's the point, isn't it? Because you talk about the confidence and impartiality, but I can't help wondering if what we've seen has led people to question the BBC's independence, which is also very important as well. You mentioned, of course, Richard Sharp, the chairman of the BBC, who failed to declare his role in facilitating an £800,000 loan to Boris Johnson. You say that you want to keep out of the Gary Lineker debate and it's for the BBC, but we're only in this position because MPs like yourself, Suella Braverman, Robert Jenrick, other Conservative backbenchers have come out very strongly to criticise the Gary Lineker tweet, and now you're just trying to wash your hands of it.
Well, I think that BBC independence really does matter for the country, and that's why I think it's important that we let the BBC sort out these problems. But what I want to see as the outcome is trust being maintained in what is a very, very important institution. When it comes to an election, we are very lucky to be in a country where we have an organisation that is an independent arbiter of the truth, so that people can find out the facts and then make their judgment about which party to vote for. That's something very precious, and that's what we want to make sure that we protect.
Do you think the current BBC leadership is seen as too close to the party of government?
Well, I don't think it's for me to make those judgments. I think that if we believe the BBC should be independent, which I do, if we believe in BBC impartiality, which I do, then we have to let the BBC resolve these issues.
I guess one of the reasons people feel strongly about impartiality is because Gary Lineker has paid an awful lot of taxpayers' money. Do you think that the funding model of the BBC should be looked at?
Well, I think we always need to keep up with the times, and, you know, we're in a world where funding models for all broadcasting is changing with, you know, the advent of streaming, for example. But do I believe in a taxpayer-funded broadcaster that is able to for example, be one of the most respected news gatherers in the world? Yes, I do. I think it's very important for the country and actually very important for the world. So I think we have something very precious with the BBC. That's why we're talking about it, even though you're a competitor of the BBC's, because it's very important to all of us. And I think what we want to come out of this is people feeling confident that the BBC is on the right track when it comes to independence, impartiality, all these things that really matter.
Well, if all that matters, you previously said that Gary Lineker should apologise. Do you still think that?
Well, I don't agree with his comments.
So should he apologise then?
I personally think that he was wrong to say what he said, but I don't think it's for me to decide how that issue is resolved.
But you previously said that he should apologise. Do you still think that?
As I say, I don't agree with what he said. As a government, we want to get on with solving the issue of illegal migration, partly because I'm very proud we're one of the most open and tolerant countries in the world when it comes to legal migration. But if you believe in BBC independence, then it's not for the Chancellor or any other government minister to say how these issues are resolved.
Rowing back then from the call for the apology, it feels like. Now, I don't want to waste time rattling through a list of possible measures that might be in the budget. You telling me you can't talk about them, frustrating for me, frustrating for you, frustrating for our viewers as well. So what, in broad terms, should we expect from your budget?
Well, I am a Conservative who believes in the virtue of work. I am incredibly proud of the fact that because we've reduced taxes on the lowest paid, changed the welfare system, introduced the national living wage, someone who is on benefit and out of work will make an extra £7,500 to £10,000 if they get a job full-time on the national living wage. And that's one of the reasons why unemployment has halved since we've been in power. But we still have over 1 million vacancies in the economy. And the Brexit decision was a choice, the right choice in my judgment, to say we shouldn't fill those vacancies from unlimited migration. We need to break down the barriers that stop people here in the UK from working, whether that's parents who have obstacles because of childcare costs, whether it's older people who feel they need to retire earlier than they might perhaps want to, whether it's long-term sick who find there are barriers to working. We need to break down those barriers. And this is a budget in which I will be systematically going through all the areas where there are barriers that stop people working who want to, so that we can help people get back to work, fill those vacancies for our businesses.
The problem is, it's quite hard to get people back to work if they don't have to, isn't it? If you're taking an early retirement and you can afford to do it, why would you leave the golf course and go back to work? And also, I understand that there are real barriers for some parents going back to work. Many people, it's a choice. They want to spend more time with a young family. Surely the easiest way to fill those vacancies, if we're real, is by immigration.
Well, I think our choice is not to do that.
Why not?
Because that was the decision in the Brexit referendum.
Well, not necessarily. I think people wanted control over borders, and you could decide to relax certain immigration rules to fill certain vacancies, couldn't you?
Controlled legal migration, but not filling every vacancy in our businesses with uncontrolled migration. And that was the decision we took by leaving the single market. We fully respect the choice of people who don't wish to work. This isn't about changing that choice, but there are lots of people. Let me give you an example. There are 700,000 parents on low pay, on universal credit, who have a child under 12 and they aren't able to work because of the high cost of childcare. Now, we're looking at whether we can remove some of those barriers, for example, by paying them their childcare in advance, not in arrears, looking at the level of support that we give them. And those are families that would really benefit if the mum or the dad was able to get back into work. That's removing a barrier that's stopping people participating in the labour force. I think that's a good thing.
Some people on your own side are getting a bit twitchy about the level of taxation, shall we say. Corporation tax is due to rise from 19% to 25%. When you ran to be party leader, this is what you told me on corporation tax. You said, I'm also someone who doesn't think we shouldn't just stop the corporation tax rises. I think we should cut them so that they're the lowest in Europe and North America. I think we should cut it to 15%. Are you really going to be the Chancellor who puts it up to 25%? What happened to that, Jeremy Hunt?
Well, it's the same Jeremy Hunt that's with you now, and I still want us to have the most competitive business taxes anywhere in the world. Look, I am a Conservative who believes in a low-tax economy. I'm incredibly proud of the fact that under successive Conservative governments, we've reduced taxes so that for the first time in our history, you can earn £1,000 a month without paying a penny of tax or national insurance. That's, by the way, that is one of the reasons why we've lifted 2 million people out of absolute poverty after housing costs. That's including 500,000 children. So it's a very, very big deal that we've done that. For businesses, we need to encourage investment by companies from overseas coming into the UK, investment by companies at home. That's how we'll close our productivity gap. But I also have to be responsible with public finances. We're not going to do what the last Labour government did and run out of money. Businesses need the stability that comes from being responsible. So we will get there gradually, but get there we will.
But let's look at the tax level, shall we? Because if you look at the current tax burden, you can see here it's projected to hit highest level since the 1960s. I'm just trying to get my head around the fact that, you say you believe in low taxes, you're a Chancellor who ran for the leadership saying he was going to cut corporation tax, and now this is a situation you are presiding over with the economy. I mean, it takes a certain amount of mental gymnastics to get there.
Well, look at where that graph starts to go up. We had a global pandemic. We've had an energy crisis. I'm actually very proud of the fact that we're a society which does believe in having a safety net. And despite the fact that our GDP fell by 20% at one point during the pandemic, we still kept unemployment low. We haven't seen thousands of people thrown onto the dole because we stepped in. But that costs money. And I think it was right that we responded in the way we did when we did. And because we have to be responsible with our public finances, yes, we are having to put taxes up temporarily. But the path we're going on, look at our track record, bringing down taxes on the lowest paid. In the autumn statement...
Track record is a tax burden that's the highest since the 1960s.
Well, I've just told you, for the first time, you don't pay a penny of tax or national insurance on the first £1,000 you earn every month. Last autumn, despite all the challenges we face, we reduced business rates by an average of 10%. So a Conservative government will always cut taxes when we can, but we won't run out of money. We'll be responsible with public finances because businesses also, Sophie, need stability. And if they're going to invest, they need to know that they've got a government that is being sensible, sound money, responsible with public finances.
It sounds, very steady as she goes. You're the Chancellor, right? This is probably the job you dreamed of when you were a kid. What's the vision? What's the big idea?
Well, when I was young, I took the decision not to get a well-paid job in the city, but to set up my own business. And that was the best decision I ever took. And I became Chancellor because I want to help people like me who have big dreams for the future. And I have big dreams for the future of our country as well. But that means taking difficult decisions when you have huge challenges like a pandemic, like an energy crisis. It means being responsible with public finances. But look at what's happened to this country in the last 13 years. We have built the third biggest tech economy in the world after America and China, the biggest life science sector in Europe, where we discovered one of the 2 big COVID vaccines, one of the major COVID treatments, the largest film and TV industry in Europe. We have got so many exciting things happening in our country, and I want to make sure that we go from strength to strength.
You talk about your vision there as a child. You were a radical on tax when you ran for the leadership. When you were chair of the Health Select Committee, you wanted to transform the NHS. And now it feels a bit like, you're running the economy as if you're Jeremy from accounts.
Well, I think you have to wait and see what I say on Wednesday. But, Jeremy, the Chancellor, will be responsible with public finances. I make absolutely no apology for that. I think families who want to know that their money is safe need to know that they have a responsible Chancellor and a responsible Conservative government. But what you will also see on Wednesday is that we have a plan to tackle the biggest problems we face as a country, whether it's a lack of investment, whether it's businesses not able to recruit. And we have a very exciting plan for the future of our country that will make us one of the most prosperous in the world.
Away from the budget, how concerned are you by the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank UK?
Well, I think the first thing to say is the Governor of the Bank of England has made it very clear there is no systemic risk to our financial system. So people should be reassured on that basis. But there is a serious risk to our technology and life sciences sectors, many of whom bank with this bank that most people won't have heard of, the Silicon Valley Bank, but it happens to look after the money of some of our most promising and exciting businesses. And so I want to reassure people, I've been in discussions over the weekend until late last night with the Chancellor, with the Prime Minister, the Governor of the Bank of England, many other people, and we are working at pace on a solution. We will bring forward very soon plans to make sure people are able to meet their cash flow requirements, pay their staff. But obviously what we want to do is to find a longer-term solution that minimises or even avoids completely losses to some of our most promising companies.
Could you step in with taxpayers' money to try and safeguard jobs?
I don't want to go into what the solution is, but what I will say, because people are worried about paying their staff next week, is we will come forward with a solution that helps those very, very important companies with things like payroll and their cash flow requirements. But we also want to put in place a longer-term solution so that their futures are secure.
And how quickly should we expect to see this package?
Well, as I say, we've been working at pace. This only started to happen on Friday. We've been working at pace over the weekend through the night. And the Prime Minister and I and the Governor of the Bank of England are absolutely determined to do everything we can to protect the future of these very, very important companies.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, that was the Chancellor talking ahead of his budget speech this coming Wednesday. So let's speak, shall we, to the woman who is going to be responding for the Labour Party. We can talk to the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, who joins us now live. Thank you for being with us. Just firstly, we were just talking to the Chancellor about the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank UK. How concerned are you, and should we be ready to put taxpayers' money in to try and help job losses?
Look, of course, I am concerned about the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, because for startups and venture capital, for life sciences and tech businesses, Silicon Valley Bank is an important source of finance. And I am slightly concerned about the urgency that you heard from the Chancellor there, because when markets open tomorrow morning, a lot of businesses in the UK are not going to be clear about how they can pay the wages of their staff, and whether their deposits with Silicon Valley Bank and their financing arrangements are still in place. So I would urge the government to do more than offer warm words, but come forward with the specific plans. Look, I don't know the full exposure. I'm not sure if the government do, but they must, by tomorrow morning, come up with a plan to give reassurance to those crucial parts of our economy.
Yeah, there's conversations going on as we speak, so I'm sure we'll be hearing more about the plan to try and solve any difficulties with Silicon Valley Bank as soon as possible. I just want to talk a bit about Gary Lineker, if I may, before we get on to your economic plan. Jeremy Hunt, very careful, saying that, look, BBC impartiality needs to be respected. It would be wrong for him to comment. But some would say what's at stake isn't impartiality, but independence. Do you think that the BBC looks too close to the party of government?
I found it pretty unedifying spectacle over the last few days as Tory MPs and Tory ministers put pressure on the BBC about Gary Lineker. And if you compare it to what happened with Richard Sharp, the chairman of the BBC, a few weeks ago, when it was discovered that he had helped facilitate an £800,000 loan for the Prime Minister, Tory MPs and Tory ministers said, nothing to see here, that's totally fine. And yet, when a football commentator dares to disagree with the government and express concerns over one of their policies, they all take to the airwaves to criticise. They say they believe in free speech when they agree with what someone says, but it's all about impartiality when they don't. So I think we do need a sense of proportionality here, and I don't think that Gary Lineker should have been taken off air.
At the same time, that's not just Conservative MPs who were unhappy with the tweet, and in particular the comparison with 1930s Germany. The Holocaust Education Trust spoke out against that. When I spoke to Labour's Emily Thornberry, she said that she thought Gary Lineker had gone too far as well.
Well, it's not about whether you agree or disagree with what he said. I wouldn't have used the language that Gary Lineker used. But do I think he should be taken off TV from doing commentary on the football? No, I don't. And I think that that was out of proportion.
Do you think that there is a crisis of confidence now in the leadership of the BBC? You mentioned there Richard Sharp, who failed to declare his role in helping to facilitate a loan to Boris Johnson. The BBC's Director General, Tim Davie, has apologised to viewers. Do they need to consider their positions?
Look, the people who I think are at fault here are the Conservative MPs and ministers who lined up to criticise Gary Lineker, putting pressure on the BBC to take him off air.
Just to jump in, because I accept that there have been Conservative MPs and members of the government who've criticised the tweet by Gary Lineker, but you've said yourself that you're able to disagree with what he said. There hasn't really been many members of the government calling for him to be sacked or come off air, unless I'm mistaken.
Well, my understanding is, you just see all the tweets and the letters being organised by Conservative MPs, Sophie. They're putting intolerable pressure on the BBC to take action over Gary Lineker. In fact, they've got more to say about Gary Lineker than they do about the cost of living crisis, about the state of our NHS, about the failed asylum system and the failure to protect our borders. More to say about Gary Lineker than, frankly, anything else, including all of the issues affecting all of our constituents on a day-to-day basis. That is the priority now of the Conservatives, some culture war, rather than the interests and the concerns of people in their day-to-day lives. That is just all wrong.
Well, let's talk about some of those concerns now, shall we? Because it is budget week. You, of course, have got a very important role as Shadow Chancellor as well. Now, you spent a long time trying to prove that Labour can be trusted on the economy. You said you would have ironclad discipline. You promised, I will never make a spending commitment without telling you where the money is coming from. Some Labour voters might think that if they look at the state of public services, then actually that's what you should be looking at doing, rather than trying to out-Tory the Conservative Party on spending.
Well, you saw what happened last year when the Conservatives' mini-budget crashed financial markets, putting pensions in peril and resulting in that long-term Tory mortgage penalty where anybody remortgaging this year is looking at paying thousands of pounds more a year. So I am absolutely determined that as Chancellor I would have an iron grip on the public finances, and any announcement that I make about spending and about priorities will say where the money's going to come from. That's why, for example, I've said that Labour would extend the windfall tax on the huge profits that energy giants are making and use that money to keep people's energy bills low. It's why I've said that Labour would get rid of the non-dom tax status, because if you make Britain your home, you should pay your taxes here, and we would use that money for one of the biggest ever expansions of the NHS workforce and free breakfast clubs at all primary schools. So when I say that we are making something a priority, I will tell you always where the money is going to come from. But it does also mean that there are some things that a Labour government might not be able to do as quickly as it wants because of those constraints. But I would never put the public finances in peril in the way that the Tories did just a few months ago, because it is ordinary people and businesses that pay the price for that sort of mess.
So if you have an iron grip on the public finances, if keeping borrowing down is key, why is the Labour Party proposing to spend £28 billion a year on the Green Prosperity Plan?
Well, I look to what President Biden is doing in the US and the response of the EU and of Australia and countries around the world that are determined to get for their countries a share of the investment in the industries of the future. And President Biden is turning the Rust Belt into an electric vehicle belt. He is getting good manufacturing jobs back to the US, and he's encouraging businesses to invest there. And Britain is frankly in the changing rooms, whilst other countries are in this global race. And a Chancellor's got to know when to say no, but they also need to know when to make prudent investments in things to get growth and productivity and investment going. And that has been a failure of this government when we are at the bottom of the league tables on productivity, investment and growth. And it will be ordinary people paying the price for that. If you look, for example, Sophie, at what the Office for Budget Responsibility say, they say that delaying action on getting to net zero by a decade doubles the cost of getting there. So it is a responsible thing to invest and to prioritise these jobs and these industries. And that is what I would do as Chancellor, because there are huge opportunities here to get us out of this low growth, low productivity cycle that we are in and turbocharge our economy.
You know, I'm not arguing against the importance of investing in climate change, but I just want to put it in context. You know, the government spends just over £4 billion a year on childcare, and you're planning to spend 7 times as much on a green prosperity plan, which is funded by borrowing. I mean, these are important priorities, but how can you say that you have an ironclad grip on the public finances, just as long as you don't look at these massive spending commitments that we've made over here?
Well, our commitments for the Green Prosperity Plan are all in the context of Labour's fiscal rules, which involve getting a grip on day-to-day spending and bringing debt down as a share of GDP. And subject to that, we will invest in the things that get our economy growing. So this is part of Labour's fiscal rules, but it is about prioritising investment in these industries of the future, as every other country around the world is doing. And the moment to act is now. There is an urgency here, because if we want those jobs and those investment, and every other country in the world wants them too, we have got to have a serious plan to invest alongside business through the National Wealth Fund that a Labour government would create to ensure that those jobs and investment come here to Britain. Otherwise, we'll find in the future that we're importing all of our cars because we failed to build the electric vehicles here, that we are importing gas and electricity because we failed to invest in green hydrogen, that we're importing steel because we failed to invest in green steel. I won't allow that future for the UK where we fall behind our competitors. We've got to act to get those jobs and investment here in the UK. That's what businesses are telling me. That is what the OBR are saying in terms of the costs of these investments, and other countries are acting. I want to see the Chancellor act in the budget this week.
Another key focus on the budget will be growth, economic growth. Do you accept that one easy way of improving that would be to increase targeted immigration?
Well, I don't think that the immigration lever is the answer to every problem. Our mission of an incoming Labour government is to have the highest sustained growth with good jobs and productivity in all parts of the country. And that means seizing the opportunities in towns and cities across the UK through our National Wealth Fund and our Green Prosperity Plan, through our reforms to make Britain the best place to start and grow a business. But we've got to be training people up here in Britain for those jobs in the industries of the future. It's why we have committed to reform the apprenticeship levy, which at the moment is seeing the number of apprentices fall and businesses spurn the system, and why we have said that we would devolve skills and employment support to local communities to ensure that businesses where they are have the skills they need to succeed. So that would be my priority, to making sure that businesses have the skills they need and that young people and people retraining later in life have the opportunity to take up the jobs that are available in the UK economy.
And just finally, has Brexit made us poorer?
Well, look, the deal that the government got is clearly not working for businesses, and every economist says, and all of the forecasts say, that that deal has made our country poorer. It's why we have said that one of our priorities for getting that growth would be reforming the Brexit deal. Not going back into the single market or customs union, not bringing back free movement, but practical changes that can help British businesses export and bring investment to the UK. So a veterinary agreement to help our great farming and fishing industries, support for our great services sector with a mutual recognition of professional qualifications, helping our brilliant creative industries with better deals about touring rights for artists, UK participation in Horizon to help our universities succeed and bring in investment. So there are practical changes that we can make so that we can ensure our economy grows and that we can take advantage of the export opportunities that exist but that the government's trade and cooperation agreement is cutting British businesses out of.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Shadow Chancellor there, Rachel Reeves.
Thank you.
You're watching Sophy Ridge on Sunday. Well, we've heard the two competing economic visions from the Chancellor and the Shadow Chancellor, and still to come on the programme this morning. We are going to be talking to the former Chancellor, Philip Hammond, on what makes a good budget and how to deal with China. And a little later on, we're also going to be hearing from the former Liverpool and England star John Barnes on how he thinks the BBC can get itself out of the Gary Lineker crisis. Well, as the Chancellor puts the finishing touches to his budget, one man knows more than most the pressure of trying to balance the books while pleasing the party faithful. Philip, now Lord Hammond, was the Chancellor of the Exchequer under Theresa May between 2016 and 2019, and he joins us now.
Good morning.
Thanks very much for being with us. Just before we get to the budget, I'm quite interested to hear your views on the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. How concerned should we be?
Well, look, it's not going to affect many individuals in the UK because not many people bank with Silicon Valley Bank, but it is going to affect the very important fintech sector in our economy, where there's a huge concentration around Silicon Valley Bank UK. And there's a lot of small, early-stage businesses that are quite important to this economy, quite important to keeping our financial services sector at the cutting edge, who will be very, very nervous today. So I hope that in the course of the day, the government, the Bank of England, Rothschilds, who are managing this process, can come up with a solution that allows those businesses to get access to their funds tomorrow morning and reassure their customers, their investors, because this is a very important, dynamic sector, and we don't want to see it suffer a massive own goal here.
I mean, those plans are being worked up as we speak. What kind of things do you think they should be looking at? I mean, should taxpayers' money be on the table?
Well, I think whatever happens, the Bank of England is going to have to provide some significant additional liquidity to whoever buys SVB, and I think that's the most likely outcome, that it will be sold.
Liquidity means money?
Cash,
yeah.
money.
Yeah.
Because, as I understand it, SVB has good quality assets. It's not a question of the firm's bust. It's a question of it's unable to turn those assets into cash quickly. And the Bank of England can help there. The Bank of England can step in and loan it money, as it routinely does to banks, to allow them to pay their depositors, settle the nerves of the market, and then unwind its assets in a more orderly fashion over a period of weeks or even months.
Thank you very much. That's interesting. Now, we heard from the Chancellor earlier on the programme. There's a lot of jitteriness among Conservatives about the level of tax in the UK. Corporation tax, obviously, due to rise by 6%, and the Chancellor was pretty clear that he's going to stick with that. Do you think that's the right decision?
I think it's the right decision for now. Of course, as I've said before, lower corporation tax is always better than higher corporation tax for economic growth. But the thing that really matters to businesses is the effective rate of taxation. And I expect we're going to hear the Chancellor making some moves on allowances and reliefs, so that for many businesses, particularly those that are investing heavily, the effective rate of corporation tax is lowered a bit. But I think what business will be looking for is, first of all, a signal from Jeremy Hunt that in the medium to long term, he does want to see corporation tax lower, that he doesn't see 25% as some new normal. That's a tax for a moment in time. And secondly, they're going to want to see that, apart from tax, the government recognises and is tackling the challenges of economic growth. There are many problems facing this economy at the moment, and if business sees the government moving to deal with those problems, it'll be a little bit less concerned about the higher rate of tax.
How do you think they should be moving to deal with that?
Well, I think there are three big challenges for any Conservative Chancellor. The first is he's got to demonstrate fiscal responsibility, and especially given the circumstances in which Rishi Sunak came into office, I think they've done a great job in stabilising the markets, stabilising the perception of the UK's public finances. But the job is absolutely not done. We're still borrowing eye-wateringly large amounts of money. I've read in the papers Jeremy Hunt might have 20 or 30 billion pounds of headroom. What that headroom really means is that he might be borrowing 20, 30 billion pounds less than we thought we would be borrowing. It's not real money.
We're still in the red.
We're massively in the red. So that job is not finished, and he's got to show an iron resolution to complete that job. Secondly, he's got to continue the battle against inflation, because it's inflation that's eroding people's living standards. But thirdly, and I think this is where we're going, hopefully, to see some strong signalling in the budget, he's got to set out a growth agenda so that when we get through this period of fiscal difficulty, when we get out of the period of high inflation, we've at least got something to look forward to, that the economy will return to growth. Because the forecasts at the moment are not very positive. Yes, the UK economy hasn't gone into a deep recession, but it is still way behind its peer group of international economies.
Do you think a recession is likely?
If there is, it looks like it'll be a shallow recession. So we'll either hover just above or just below the line on recession. But the real problem here is looking out a year or 2 years. What we're not seeing is any signals that we'll return to strong economic growth. And we need something a bit more than an anemic sort of 0.75%, 1%, 1.25%. We need to find a way of getting this economy back to growing at 2% a year, year in, year out. That's the way we raise people's living standards.
Jeremy Hunt talked a lot about getting people back into the workplace, which is pretty hard, right? If you're left the workplace and you can afford to do so, it's quite difficult to get those people back in. I mean, there is an easier way to do this, right, to fill the vacancies, which would be to relax certain immigration rules. Should they be looking at that?
So the problems in our economy are mainly on the supply side of the economy. It's not that there isn't demand, it's that there aren't the resources to meet that demand. There isn't the land with planning permission to build the houses that people want or the factories that people want. There aren't the workers to fill the jobs that are available. So you're absolutely right. The most obvious way to deal particularly with the need for lower skilled workers would be to relax immigration rules. But of course, there is another political agenda out there which is very concerned about levels of immigration, and this all gets mixed up with the Brexit debate and the end of free movement.
To be honest, do you basically think that the most sensible thing to do from a purely economic perspective is to relax immigration rules, but it's the politics that's preventing you from doing that?
If I was the Chancellor and I was unconstrained, I would relax the immigration rules in a very specific and narrow way, in that I would issue a certain number of short-term work visas for people who would come here to do mainly lower skilled work with no right to remain, no rights of settlement, come, stay 3 years, work and leave. Jeremy Hunt won't do that because of political constraints. What he's going to do, I think, and the signalling is pretty clear, is focus on trying to get people who are already here into the workforce. So people who've retired early, getting them back in, people who are thinking of retiring early, deterring them from doing that, people who are out because of long-term health or mental health problems, helping them to get back into the workforce. And I think you'll see a mixture of carrots and sticks, some generous childcare support, some additional work training and support for people who want to get back into the workforce, coupled with a slightly tighter regime for benefits for people who choose to stay out of the workforce for long periods. I
just want to zoom out for a minute. The Conservative Party's polling is abysmal, right? It's looking like
it's not very... great.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. What do you think the Conservative Party needs to do if you're going to have any chance of winning the next election? It feels to me like you're focusing an awful lot on red wall seats and perhaps not on the blue wall seats like the ones that you used to represent.
Yeah. Well, I think, to be honest, Rishi Sunak's doing it. What needs to be done, the only thing he can do after a period of extreme turbulence is demonstrate again to people that Conservative governments deliver fiscal stability, get inflation down and promote sound money, and can deliver a growth agenda for the medium term. That's the bit that's missing at the moment. And the thing that I really want to see on Wednesday is a narrative that shows that, you know, problems with backbench Tory groups who don't like house building, for example, or who don't want closer relations with major trading partners like Europe, or who don't want to see relaxation of migration rules, can be overcome. The Tory party must go into the next election as the party of fiscal responsibility and economic growth. It can't win an election unless it is the champion of those two principles.
You're talking about the need for close links with trading partners. Another of those trading partners is China. I was quite interested in the speech you made in February, where you talked about the trading relationship, and you said this. You said, for all the noises we hear, many of our global partners have been quietly increasing their share of trade with China, while we have seen ours stagnate over the pandemic period. Time now to roll the sleeves up and get that market share climbing. So you think we should be doing more trade with China?
Yes, I do. I think, and we have to be clear-eyed about China. This has always been my view on China. China has a very different political system, very different culture, very different history from us, and we disagree profoundly with them on some important issues. But we disagree profoundly with a lot of people on important issues, and we still trade with them. China is our fourth biggest trading partner, our sixth biggest export market. We proclaim that the UK is a great global trading nation. We cannot simply turn our back on the world's second largest economy and our fourth largest trading partner. We have to engage with them, and we have to be clear that simply because we're trading with someone doesn't mean we endorse their politics or their political culture in any way. But we've got a long tradition in the UK of trade-led diplomacy, and I think if we build our trading links, we then work on the other issues that divide us.
I mean, a lot of your colleagues would disagree with that, and not least because of human rights abuses that we've seen in Hong Kong, the treatment of the Uyghurs. Reports in the Sunday Times today that the UK wants to see TikTok banned from all UK government electronic devices.
Well, that's a specific security issue, and we need to look at that on its merits. But we trade with lots of people with whom we have human rights concerns. We have to be pragmatic about the fact that we're talking about the world's second largest economy here. And somehow I think some of my colleagues have got a mindset that when we trade with somebody, we're doing them a favour. Believe me, it doesn't work like that. We need to trade. We are a trading nation. After Brexit, after COVID, after the energy price crisis, we have a challenge in this country about how to deliver growth, how to earn our living so that we can maintain our public services, we can improve people's standards of living in the future. And trade has to be a part of that. It's not a choice for us. We've got to get on and trade with the world.
Now, before I let you go, I want to get your take on the Gary Lineker row. I quite like questions where I don't actually know what the answer is going to be. And with you and Gary Lineker and the BBC, I feel like I genuinely don't know what your view is on this, which is always quite a good position to start off with. What is your view? Is he entitled to express his beliefs, or does it go against the impartiality of the BBC?
So I think there's two things, and I'm not an expert in this area, but there's two things that struck me reading this debate. We're in danger of confusing two separate issues. There's the impartiality of the BBC, which is a very important principle, of course, for a public service broadcaster. And it's, I think, probably, by and large, the BBC usually gets it mostly right, and I know that because people in my party feel that the BBC is institutionally biased against it, and I know that people in the Labour Party equally feel that the BBC is institutionally biased against it. So it's probably doing something about right. Then there's a separate issue about whether individuals who are closely associated with large corporations can publicly express views which are highly controversial and are not the views of that corporation. And I think, generally speaking, that is not acceptable. It's even more important when the corporation is a public body, like the BBC or indeed the civil service. The same would be true of a senior civil servant tweeting out something that was highly controversial. But look, it goes further than that. If a senior executive of Sky were to tweet something highly controversial, they'd have a problem with their management. If a senior executive of one of Britain's major banks...
But it's also slightly... It's different as well because of the licence fee money as well, right?
Yeah, of course, there's the public element, but if you talk to senior executives or senior figures across high-profile businesses in the UK, I think you'll find them all saying that they are extremely cautious about publicly expressing views that are controversial, unless they are clearly the views of the corporation they work for.
Just very finally, is there a risk the BBC looks too close to the government right now, that they've stepped in, double-footed, if you like, a double-footed tackle on Gary Lineker? We have the row over Richard Sharp not disclosing his involvement in facilitating a loan to Boris Johnson. Is it swinging too much?
Well, look, this is the point, isn't it? No doubt there will be many people on the left of politics saying, look at this is another example of the BBC cozying up to the Tory party. I can tell you that the vast majority of my former colleagues in the parliamentary Tory party see the BBC in a different light as
the current
as a
BBC
champion
leadership,
of the left of centre.
It feels like the scrutiny is on their closeness to the Conservative Party.
And
and
it's right that there should be scrutiny on it.
OK, thank you very much indeed, Lord Hammond. Thank you. We've just been talking about Gary Lineker, who, of course, has got himself into a bit of trouble with the BBC before. The Match of the Day presenter has been warned in the past that tweeting about politics was against the corporation's impartiality rules. But the latest row has not only seen the former footballer taken off air, it's also seen many of his colleagues come together in support, with programmes cancelled and many have saying a mess of the BBC's own mating. So what is going to happen next? Well, we can talk now to the former Liverpool and England striker, John Barnes. Great to have you on the programme. You've said that you're 100% behind Gary Lineker. Why is that?
Well, first of all, there are two issues. I was listening to the gentleman before. In terms of impartiality, I don't know when the BBC has ever been impartial. In fact, BBC's reporting on the Qatar World Cup was anything but impartial. So it seems that they want to pick and choose when they want to be impartial. Criticising others or criticising other countries or other political parties or other religions seems to be OK. But of course, if you then criticise what goes on in this country, then it seems that they will then come out with this impartiality rule. The second thing, which a lot of people took offence to, is the perception that Gary was equating Britain to Nazi Germany, which he wasn't. What he said was the language used regarding the refugees is similar to the language used in 1930s Germany, which it was. And of course, we can see how that ended up. And Gary is not saying, I'm not saying that that's how it's going to end up. But of course, the language used in terms of creating this perception of an unworthy refugee, very much like the Jews were unworthy to be German, and Germans were better than Jews. That was the language that was used, and that's what we're saying here. We're talking about the refugees coming over, and the language used towards the refugees coming over on boats, in terms of them being rapists, in terms of them being criminals, is different to the refugees from the Ukraine. And that is what we have to address. And that is what I want Gary and everybody supporting him to talk about. Us talking about the worthiness of different groups of people, because that's how discrimination starts. Be it men, women towards men, in terms of the worthiness of a woman towards a man, blacks towards whites, gays towards straight people, and a Syrian refugee coming over on a boat in relation to a Ukrainian refugee coming over. We don't hear language from the Ukrainian refugees situation talking about rapists and murderers, but we hear it about the Iraqis and the Syrians. And that's what I would like Gary and people to talk about. The worthiness of everybody, including the Syrian refugees, in relation to the Ukrainian refugees.
Look, you raised some really important points and points that many people are going to have strong views about, right? But I guess what some would argue is that is Gary Lineker the right person to be entering this debate? He's paid licence fee money. He is presenter of the BBC's flagship programme. Is it right that this kind of political debate should be entering the world of sport?
Would Gary Lineker be the right person to talk about the LGBTQ rights and human rights in Qatar? We can't have it both ways. We accept that. So why can't he talk about it here? So this is the point I'm making about impartiality, and we're saying that stick to sports. But when we want to criticize other countries or other religions, we then say, yes, let the sports people come out and talk about that, but don't criticize what goes on in this country. We can't have it both ways.
Interesting. You're talking there about the sort of double standards and what you would see as you can't have it both ways, certainly. We've seen a wave of sports presenters, commentators refusing to appear on the BBC in support of Gary Lineker. Do you think that they're right to do that?
Well, of course, if that's what they believe, and they believe in what Gary's talking about. I'm not supporting Gary because I'm Gary's friend or I played with him. I'm supporting him because I believe it's right to do. But as I said, let's not make this, and this should not be about Gary Lineker and the BBC pundits supporting him. This should be about the refugees and them coming over, and that's the conversation that should be had. Now, this is a distraction to, and I suppose the government is quite happy with this, a distraction to the cost of living crisis, a distraction to, you know, the working conditions for the nurses and railway workers and postal workers. So this is probably quite welcome, because of course no one's now talking about real issues, you know, because this really is just a sideshow and it's inconsequential and it's meaningless. But we've had 3 or 4 days and it will continue to run, and I think it's quite a welcome distraction to real issues from the government.
How do you see it being resolved? Because you have got the people who are supporting Gary Lineker refusing to, if you like, cross the invisible picket line. You've got the Director General of the BBC apologising. Where does this go?
Well, of course, a compromise will be had. They'll come back together. The profile of lots of people will be raised. The profile of the BBC will be raised, and they'll do the right thing. And it'll be, the status quo will resume very shortly with everybody being happy.
Do you think that the BBC guidelines themselves need to be looked at? And perhaps it's a bit of unclarity, shall we say, a lack of clarity in the guidelines themselves.
Absolutely, very ambiguous. And of course, Gary is also freelance. So as to whether he is fully employed by the BBC, so he's able to say things, and I suppose Gary probably thought, well, if I'm in Qatar talking about human rights abuses, then why can't I talk about what I believe to be right here as well? So I think there's a lot of ambiguity to it. And of course, I'm not a lawyer, but you can pick different things out of contracts and say, yes, you're allowed to, but you're not allowed to. And everybody has an argument. So, you know, how can you become more clear without saying you're completely impartial, you can't mention it at all, even in your private life, even if you're freelance. But as I said, I'm just sad that this has been going on for so long when we have many more issues to talk about.
Have you had a call to present Match of the Day?
No. I think they've lost my number. I'm called by many people for many years.
You know what? If you volunteered to do it now, I bet they'd be on the phone straight away. Would you do it?
Well, only because there's nobody else. No, I wouldn't do it. Presenting, if I was able to present, I would think about it. But my presenting days are over. But I suppose that anybody who's going to be doing it now is because there's nobody else to do it who can do it. But I won't be one of them, no.
Thank you very much. Good to talk to you today, John Barnes there. Well, as John Barnes was saying, there is lots of other issues for us to get stuck into other than the tweets of Gary Lineker. And one of them is the SNP leadership competition. The three candidates took to the stage in their first, will be taking to stage in their first televised debate this week. It became clear how deep those divisions in the party have become. And Nicola Sturgeon's shock decision to stand down as leader really has left the party fighting to define its future and perhaps the future of Scotland. Well, tomorrow night, all three candidates will go live on Sky News with our political editor Beth Rigby hosting the debate, so definitely one to tune into. Well, joining us now from Aberdeen is the MSP for Edinburgh Eastern, SNP leadership candidate Ash Regan. Thank you so much for being on the programme. What's your position on Gary Lineker then?
Sorry, can you repeat that, Sophie?
What's your position on Gary Lineker?
Yes, I was asked this the other night, actually, and I hadn't seen his tweets. But yeah, I think the way he's been treated is pretty terrible, actually. He should be allowed to express his views. And I think morally, what's going on at the moment with the Conservatives and their position on this is morally reprehensible.
Strong words there on the row over that Gary Lineker tweet. Well, look, I'm very keen to talk about your own pitch, right? You want to be the next leader of the SNP. You want to be the next First Minister. What is the big idea?
Well, as you can understand, the membership of the SNP are very concerned about the way that the UK is going. If you think about what we're facing at the moment, we've got skyrocketing energy costs because of the Conservative mismanagement of the economy. Inflation is making everything much more expensive for families, including food. And we were dragged out of the EU against our will, which is having a disproportionate impact on the Scottish economy. So things are looking difficult at the moment up here. And I think it's entirely right to be able to look at this question again of independence. And that is something that obviously the members of the SNP are very interested in. When and how would we be able to get to an independent Scotland?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? You launched your campaign with the slogan, independence, nothing less, but the government in Westminster have refused to grant the referendum. So how do you get there?
They have. And that is obviously within their gift to refuse a referendum. And if you think about it, the reason that they're refusing a referendum is because they don't want to allow Scotland to express its democratic will at the ballot box. But what we need to remember here is that not many countries achieve their independence through referendums. Actually, that's fairly unusual. And that actually it's much more normal to use a scheduled election, to use the ballot box in order for the people to express their will.
The problem is, though, if you say you'd use an election as a de facto referendum, but who are you to say that people are only voting on independence? They might think the SNP's got the best policy on the cost of living. They might think that you, Ash Regan, have got the best policy when it comes to the Gender Recognition Act. And that's not how the Westminster government would see it either, is it?
So the de facto referendum is it's a similar strategy, but it's a different strategy. The de facto referendum is fought on a single occasion, on a single issue. And you're quite right to point out that at the moment, with the things that are going on right now, energy crisis, cost of living crisis, problems in the NHS across the UK, the public will quite rightly not want to fight a single issue de facto referendums. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is the voter empowerment mechanism. And this sets up a permanent mechanism to run each and every election in Scotland as an opportunity for the people of Scotland to express their will over whether they want to govern themselves. So the trigger point for that would be 50% plus one. That is a strategy that used to be widely accepted. This was an SNP policy up until about the year 2000. It was previously accepted by the Conservatives in Westminster. Margaret Thatcher herself had said on this policy years ago that this was perfectly democratic and it was a legitimate way for the Scottish people to express their will. So I expect that the UK government would understand that democratic mandate if that was expressed by the people of Scotland, and that they would recognise it. They often start off saying no, but then they always come to the table and eventually say yes.
OK, we'll have to see on that one. Now, I hope this doesn't sound too harsh, but you have got an absolute mountain to climb in this leadership competition. A recent Ipsos Scotland poll found 32% saying Kate Forbes would make the best First Minister. Hamza Yousaf was on 24%. You're on 8%. If you don't win, who are you going to endorse?
I'm in this competition to win it. I've been having a lot of support expressed to me by the membership. And we have to remember, it's fairly difficult, I think, to get an accurate idea of what the SNP membership are thinking. At the moment, we understand that there's a large amount of the membership that are still undecided. It's a very short contest. So it's certainly true to say that I am probably the least well-known out of the candidates and with less name recognition. And it is an opportunity for me to work that bit harder, to set out my stall, if you like, on what I'm proposing to do. But I have had many people get in touch with me recently to say that they think that I am the only hope for the SNP. We are at a crossroads at the moment in terms of where we go next. And I believe I'm the candidate that is setting out a credible, democratic means for Scotland to express its will at the ballot box and give Scotland that choice over their own future.
I thought it was interesting to hear that you say that you think it's a conflict of interest that Peter Murrell, Nicola Sturgeon's husband, to remain as the SNP chief executive while this leadership contest is going along. I mean, he doesn't have a role in the ballot. Why do you think that?
Well, effectively, he's running the contest to replace his wife. And I think if we think of that in a different way, that would be like Carrie counting the votes for Boris's successor. And I think many people would think that that would be fairly unusual. I think there is a conflict of interest here. My campaign team, we've set out that we think it should be an independent third-party company that should be running the contest, and that we've also asked for there to be a neutral observer as well, just to make sure everything's above board. We need to be careful in this too. We're the largest party in Scotland, and the person that wins this contest will not just be leader of the SNP, but they'll actually also become the first minister of the country. This is very significant. It's very important. And it's important for both the members of the SNP, but also the wider country, that there's trust in this process, that it's all above board and it's transparent.
Now, you disagreed with Nicola Sturgeon over the gender recognition reform bill. You resigned from government so you could vote against it. Nicola Sturgeon said you didn't approach her with your concerns. Is that true?
I did have many conversations inside government with special advisors. I raised this issue in 2019 at Cabinet with Nicola Sturgeon. So my views inside government were well known on this issue. So
she's not really being honest in your opinion then?
Well, as I said, I also signed an open letter with many of my colleagues in 2019 to the newspapers. So I don't think it's credible to say that my views were not well known.
OK. Now, just finally, you said earlier in the interview that you were the least well-known candidate in the competition. So I thought we'd do something about that with a couple of quick-fire questions to end. Ready? Who's your political hero?
I don't really have one. I admire many people who've made big social changes, but there's certainly not anyone in the recent history that I would name particularly.
Ever broken the law?
Not that I can remember, no. Speeding,
guilty pleasure?
Definitely. Sorry?
Guilty pleasure?
Guilty pleasure. Watching a very lightweight television when I'm tired.
Go on, what example? Give an example. I'm terrible on this stuff as well, so no judgment here.
Bridgerton or something like that, a guilty pleasure.
And what's your greatest achievement?
Well, I was very proud, actually, of being able to stand up in the Scottish Parliament, with a very small number of people, actually, and make the case for the fact that there was a conflict of rights under the Gender Recognition Reform Bill. There was a great sense, I think, in Scotland that the voices of women particularly hadn't been heard during this process. And so I was proud to give voice to that during the Stage 3 debate and raise those issues that women had expressed to me and make that case in public for them and speak for them. OK, thank you very much for being on the programme. Good to have you on one of a series of debates we're doing, of interviews, shall I say, that we're doing with the leadership candidates. Thank you. Thank you. And a reminder that tomorrow night, Sky News is going to have a special debate on the race to become Scotland's First Minister. It is definitely going to be worth your time. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, is going to be joined by the three candidates. That's Kate Forbes, Thunder Youthfest, and Ash Regan, who, of course, we've just heard from there. So that is tomorrow evening, 7 p.m, live from Edinburgh. So put that in your calendars. Well, that is it for this week's Sophy Ridge on Sunday. Busy show today. In a moment after the break, we are going to be running through today's interviews, seeing what we've learned. We're going to be joined here in the studio by our political correspondent, Liz Bates. Thanks for joining us this Sunday morning. Hello, welcome back. Now it's time for The Take, where we pick apart some of the interviews over the last hour and also just talk a bit more widely about some of the big political stories of the week. Now, we're joined, I'm very pleased to say, by our political correspondent, Liz Bates, who's here in the studio with us this Sunday morning. Liz, it was such a strange show today because it's one of these ones that you have in your diary for ages, right? The pre-budget show, it takes a certain amount of... It always goes the same way, right? You have the Chancellor talking about what's going to be in the budget, you have the Shadow Chancellor, and then it felt that the whole thing was thrown a complete curveball by this Gary Lineker story that has just exploded.
Completely. And I was watching the show this morning thinking you're actually in quite a bizarre position when you have the Chancellor on, a former Chancellor, a contender to be the next leader of the Scottish Government, and you have to ask them about a tweet that a footballer did. But that's the situation that we're in at the moment. And of course, it does seem in some ways quite trivial, but there are so many underlying problems that have been kind of brought into the open by what's gone on with Gary Lineker. And it really is potentially a bit of a problem for the Conservative Party. And I think that's why you saw this morning Jeremy Hunt trying to step back from it a little bit. I think that's something that's come from on high at number 10, the Prime Minister wanting to step back from it. The last thing that they want this to turn into is a narrative that the Conservative Party has been sort of having influence within the BBC, putting pressure on in various ways and getting to the point where one of their biggest stars, and you could describe him, I think, fairly as a national treasure, is being silenced via the government through the top tier of the BBC. And I think there's a danger of that, and you can see them trying to pull back from it. Yeah, that's it. And also your point there that you might think it's trivial, but actually it's not trivial because it goes to the heart of government influence in the media, the independence of the BBC, plus Match of the Day, one of the most watched programmes, and suddenly there's no commentary on it. What is going on? It's interesting to hear Liz saying there about how she felt that Jeremy Hunt was rowing back, shall we say, about some of his criticism of Gary Lineker's comments, and I felt that too in the interview. Let's have a quick listen.
Well, I personally profoundly disagree with the comments that he made. But I think what this shows, and indeed the related debate about the BBC chairman's appointment, and we should wait until the investigation is completely independent investigation before passing judgment on that, is that impartiality at the BBC is really important. The reason that it is a great national institution that we all treasure so much is because it is respected for impartiality. But I don't think it's for me to decide how that issue is resolved.
But you previously said that he should apologise. Do you still think that?
As I say, I don't agree with what he said. As a government, we want to get on with solving the issue of illegal migration, partly because I'm very proud we're one of the most open and tolerant countries in the world when it comes to legal migration. But if you believe in BBC independence, then it's not for the Chancellor or any other government minister to say how these issues are resolved.
I mean, I asked him 3 or 4 times about whether he thought Gary Lineker should apologise, which he has previously done, and he didn't take the opportunity to do.
I mean, I think that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing them trying to extract themselves from this row that they think could be incredibly damaging. And look, there is a long-standing problem with the BBC trying to be totally separate from government, trying to be politically impartial, when at the same time it, rather uniquely in this country, has a huge influence on British culture, and its financial future lies in the hands of the government. So there's always been a bit of a tension there. I thought it was really interesting this morning with Jeremy Hunt, the way he was quite willing to praise the BBC as well, and wanting to be sort of quite balanced in that. A real shift when you think about the last few years under Boris Johnson, and particularly Nadine Dorries as the Culture Secretary, the hostility that has come from this government towards the BBC. And I think that's partly why we've got to this position. They've been threatening them for many years with removing the licence fee, and been very critical in public in a way that is, I think, quite different from previous administrations. And I think what you've seen in Gary Lineker is those festering tensions coming to a head. He's almost become a lightning rod for all of this, and now some of this stuff really has to come out into the open.
Yeah, and that's certainly, I guess, the Labour view as well, isn't it, right? Rachel Reeves really... we were talking there about how Jeremy Hunt was trying to lean back from the debate. Well, Rachel Reeves is doing the opposite. She is leaning right into it. This is what happened when I spoke to the Shadow.
I found it pretty unedifying spectacle over the last few days as Tory MPs and Tory ministers put pressure on the BBC about Gary Lineker. And if you compare it to what happened with Richard Sharp, the chairman of the BBC, a few weeks ago, when it was discovered that he had helped facilitate an £800,000 loan for the Prime Minister, Tory MPs and Tory ministers said, nothing to see here, that's totally fine. And yet, when a football commentator dares to disagree with the government and express concerns over one of their policies, they all take to the airwaves to criticise. They say they believe in free speech when they agree with what someone says, but it's all about impartiality when they don't. So I think we do need a sense of proportionality here, and I don't think that Gary Lineker should have been taken off air.
I think the backdrop to this is quite important as well, right? Because there is also a row over Richard Sharp, the chairman of the BBC, and his involvement in facilitating an £800,000 loan to Boris Johnson. Does this play into more widespread concern, do you think?
I think it does play into more widespread concerns, and exactly what I was talking about earlier, that difficult relationship that the government has with the BBC. The issue with Richard Sharp is ongoing, but I think, you know, that will clearly come up again, particularly in the context of everything that's going on. I do think on Labour's position, though, you know, really punchy there from Rachel Reeves, they have waited for a couple of days, really, to see which way the wind is blowing. And now suddenly it's quite clear that Gary Lineker has many, many very famous, very well-loved people on his side. A few days ago, there were senior Labour figures saying... we're not really sure about the Gary Lineker comments.
Yeah.
Maybe he shouldn't. Maybe he's gone too far. Really sitting on the fence, and suddenly things have changed, and the momentum seems to be very much behind Gary Lineker. And now suddenly the Labour Party are very much behind Gary Lineker as well.
Yeah, Emily Thornbury sat in the studio saying she thought that he'd gone too far.
Yeah.
I don't think you hear that one right now in that debate. You a Match of the Day fan, Liz?
No, but I'm aware that football exists. I know you're a big Match of the Day fan, Sophie.
Yeah, I love the John Barnes comment. I was saying, oh, if you got the call, he was like, no, and also if you got the call now, you'd know it was only because no one else wanted to do it, which I thought was actually, pretty accurate, probably. We'll have more from Liz after the break, when we're going to be talking about the other really, really big story today, this week's budget. Oh, welcome back. Now, a really big political week coming up, of course, with the budget on Wednesday. And there is a lot of nervousness about tax levels, particularly, of course, from Conservative backbenchers. And one thing I was keen to ask the Chancellor about was he, of course, was the guy who pitched for a big cut in corporation tax when he was running for the leadership. Now he is planning to have it overseen going up by 6%. So I asked him if he's going to be as radical as some of his previous roles when he delivers Wednesday's budget.
When I was young, I took the decision not to get a well-paid job in the city, but to set up my own business. And that was the best decision I ever took. And I became Chancellor because I want to help people like me who have big dreams for the future. And I have big dreams for the future of our country as well.
You know, you were a radical on tax when you ran for the leadership. When you were chair of the Health Select Committee, you wanted to transform the NHS. And now it feels a bit like, you know, you're running the economy as if you're Jeremy from accounts.
Well, I think you have to wait and see what I say on Wednesday. But, you know, Jeremy, the Chancellor, will be responsible with public finances. I make absolutely no apology for that. I think families who want to know that their money is safe need to know that they have a responsible Chancellor.
Jeremy Hunt talking to us a bit earlier about the budget. I mean, I don't think he was best pleased with the Jeremy from accounts comparison, but it does feel like it's going to be a pretty steady as she goes budget.
I think it is, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, because that is more, and we've seen this already under Rishi Sunak, that's more of his political style. He is a bit more, you know, he wants to be seen as somebody that gets into the detail of things. He's competent. He wants to fix things. He's not a huge showman when you compare him to somebody like Boris Johnson. And I think him and Jeremy Hunt have been working together, and that's how they see this budget. They want it to land in a way that is basically a little bit boring. And of course, you know, we saw that budget under Liz Truss. That was anything but boring. That is the thing that they want to avoid at all costs. So I think that's what you'll see with this budget. I did think it was interesting to see what some of his priorities were. And you were right to push him on tax because there's a huge amount of pressure coming from the Conservative Party to cut taxes. I don't think at the moment that faction of the Conservative Party has enough sway over the government, and the internal feeling within the party at the moment is you need to wait. You had your tax cuts. They didn't work. We're going to take a different route. We want to get the public finances under control. I think the power at the moment is with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, and there's a feeling of let us do what we want. And there's also a feeling that tax cuts will come. So they want to wait until we get closer to a general election to say, look, now we've studied the public finances, now we can be the party of tax cuts, but it's not the right moment.
It's interesting you say there that the power is with Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt rather than, I guess, the faction to the right of the Conservative Party. Has that changed? Because it felt like, you know, a few weeks ago when we were talking about the Brexit deal, before that was unveiled, that we were talking about the precariousness of Rishi Sunak's position. Do you think he shored it up a bit more recently? I
actually think he has shored it up a bit more recently, and I think that's to do with a couple of things, primarily what happened with the Northern Ireland Protocol. Because I think there were huge questions around Rishi Sunak, particularly as those negotiations were going on, and there was only a small group of people involved. It was felt that he was keeping the Brexiteers and the DUP in the dark. And then suddenly this deal emerged, which showed that he had really understood people's concerns from across the party. At the same time, he'd gone to Europe, charmed European leaders and got huge concessions that his predecessors could never have even dreamed of. And I think largely in the Conservative Party, there was a feeling that he was really showing competence and statesmanship that no one was really expecting from him. And at that moment, it felt that his party came under much more control. And I think that's what we're seeing going forward. We saw it's been largely overshadowed by Gary Lineker, but he went to visit President Macron, a summit that hadn't been held for 5 years. That was quite successful, lots of concrete policies on the table there. And I think what you're seeing here is Rishi Sunak stamping his authority on his party, and alongside Jeremy Hunt, I think we'll see that with the budget as well. Yeah, well, I'm going to ask you a little bit later what your thoughts are on the budget, but just in the meantime, the other area where the Chancellor is trying to show stability, shall we say, is over the UK arm of Silicon Valley Bank, which has collapsed. There's clearly a lot of concern about this and about what it means for small firms in the UK. Let's listen to his answer.
We will come forward with a solution that helps those very, very important companies with things like payroll and their cash flow requirements, but we also want to put in place a longer-term solution so that their futures are secure.
And how quickly should we expect to see this package?
Well, as I say, we've been working at pace. This only started to happen on Friday. We've been working at pace over the weekend through the night, and the Prime Minister and I and the Governor of the Bank of England are absolutely determined to do everything we can to protect the future of these very, very important companies.
Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, also adding her voice to those who say that, look, they need to come up with a plan quickly. And it was interesting, I thought, to hear Philip Hammond as well, the former Chancellor, saying that basically what needs to happen is a Bank of England providing liquidity, i.e. cash, to some of the firms impacted by this. So, Liz, Wednesday, big day. What are we going to see in the budget then?
Well, I think it became a little bit clearer, and we've seen a lot of, as we do these days, a lot of the policies already trailed in the newspapers. But I think it was quite clear from the way that Jeremy Hunt was speaking today that his priority is to solve some of the problems in the UK's labour market. And we see that there are gaps all over the place for various reasons. Some of it is because of Brexit, long-term sick, but also over 50s dropping out of the labour market. And you simply cannot tackle inflation and go for growth in the economy unless you tackle these problems. And I think the way that Jeremy Hunt was speaking about that today, those will be the measures that they are focusing on. So that's really what I expect to see from the budget.
Bit of an increase in defence spending as well. I didn't ask him about it because, look, I hate these budget interviews where you ask about policies and they're just going to say, wait to the budget, wait to the budget, wait to the budget. It's frustrating for everyone involved. But it feels like that is an area where they're going to get a boost, right?
I think so, and I think for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because they do have a bit more spending headroom than they were expecting. As I said, the pressures on tax, I don't think they're huge at the moment, so I think they can hold off on those for a little bit. And I also think that the UK's military capability has really been in the spotlight, particularly over Ukraine, because we've been offering support, and that has then raised questions about how much support we can offer because of the level of equipment and staffing that we have in the army and other aspects of the military. This is something Conservative MPs have been calling for a very long time to increase spending in that area. And so I think that could be potentially a big win, an easy win. I wouldn't be surprised if that comes as well.
Yeah, we can have a look. Definitely worth keeping an eye on as well. The other interview that we had on the programme was with the SNP leadership hopeful Ash Regan. She's, of course, going to be appearing in the big Sky News debate on Monday night, hosted by Beth Rigby. So that's definitely one to set your alarms for, because I think it'd be fascinating to see the three of them go head-to-head. It's been a really fiery campaign so far. And actually, I thought Ash Regan did exactly the same thing as well, talking about how she thought Nicola Sturgeon's husband shouldn't have any involvement, he shouldn't be chief executive while the campaign is going on. She really kind of went in there, I thought.
She really did. Look, I mean, it's a fascinating leadership election to watch. And I think the thing that has really come across very strongly to me is that Nicola Sturgeon at the top of that party was holding a lot of different factions together. And this is sometimes what you see in leaders that are have a huge amount of influence on a particular party. They leave and suddenly all of the cracks appear, and that's what you're seeing going on at the moment. I think the challenge for the SNP will be, after this leadership contest has finished, to actually put the party back together and to mend itself after what will be a period of very damaging infighting, actually.
It's such a change, isn't it? Because we've had this period of complete SNP dominance. Nicola Sturgeon, who has polled very well, she's been a popular leader, she's someone who's got a really high profile. And as you say, these divisions have been exposed. We have three candidates, none of which have got the approval ratings of Nicola Sturgeon. Do you think this is going to transform the political landscape in Scotland?
Look, I think it certainly has the possibility to, because we've seen the dominance of the SNP over such a long period of time. And I think that is intrinsically linked to Nicola Sturgeon and to her predecessor, of course, Alex Salmond, these, very dominant political figures.
And still dominant. They're backing different candidates, right? Or even if not publicly, we kind of know that they are behind the scenes.
Yeah. And this is what has dominated Scottish politics for so long. And I think, look, it's obvious from speaking to the Labour Party, they are selecting candidates at the moment in Scotland, and suddenly all these candidates have come out of nowhere. They are really sensing that they could be the ones that really benefit from what potentially could be a difficult period for the SNP. But I think it all depends on how they get to the end of this contest and how they pick themselves back up afterwards, because there's still there's still a lot of support within Scotland for the independence movement. So they just have to make sure that they don't, that this contest doesn't become too vitriolic.
Yeah, as you say, SNP is still wildly popular. Most political parties can only dream of having the amount of poll ratings that they do. I did think it was interesting talking about Labour. There was an event recently where Keir Starmer went to Scotland, and all of the political journalists were like tweeting the amazing breakfast buffet spread that had been put on. They were like, "Oh, they're trying to butter us up." You know, they know, they know which way the wind is blowing.
It's not difficult to buy off journalists with breakfast and other foods.
There you go.
Speaking from personal experience.
I just want to remind you, of course, about the debate that's going to be on Sky News tomorrow night. The Scotland leadership debate, live from Edinburgh. That's going to be at 7 p.m. and Beth Rigby, our political editor, is going to be joined by the three candidates, Kate Forbes, Hamza Youssef and Ash Regan. Tomorrow night, 7 p.m. So definitely one to look out for. Well, it's been a very busy programme today. As we were just discussing with Liz, you know, we really did think that it was all going to be about the budget, but there's certainly been other issues elbowing their way onto the news agenda. Do you think the Gary Lineker story is starting to burn out, or do you think that actually it's got some way to go?
It seems to me to be unresolved at the moment. I think there are more issues that will come up. I have to say, I think the handling of it has maybe added to the attention that has fallen on it. But I think what's quite clear at the moment is that the balance of power hangs with Gary Lineker. He has all of the BBC staff, including some incredibly high-profile people, behind him, and I think this will go on. The interesting thing will be if it's a problem for the government.
There we are, the man with all the power in his hands. Gary Lineker there. We'll see what happens. Well, that is it from this week's Sophy Ridge on Sunday. This morning, do join us for the podcast, though. Me and Liz are going to be giving some of our views on the podcast, plus you can hear some of the best interviews from the show as well. It should be available around lunchtime. See you next Sunday, in which time we'll know what's been in the budget.